All right. Well, welcome everybody. My name is Dan Petrik. I'm the Lake and River Shoreland Program Manager with the DNR, administering the state's Shoreland program, today's subject, as well as the Wild and Scenic River, Lower St. Croix, and Critical Area programs. These regulatory programs are all similar in that they regulate development around lakes and rivers to minimize impacts from development. These programs are all administered through your local government ordinances if you happen to have that type of resource. And our authority is to work with you to ensure that your zoning standards are consistent with the relevant state rules. This training today is on the Shoreland program, the largest of our lake and river programs. And it's a basics course intended for local government staff and consultants taking on shoreland administration, or for those of you who want a refresher. The presentation is about 45 minutes, and we'll try to address questions that you have as we go through, if you would just use the chat. Matt Bauman's online, and we'll be helping with that. For questions that might require a longer response, I will pause at a good place and try to answer the question for you as well as I can. So with that, let's go on to the next slide here. Today, we will be covering 4 things. First, we want to make sure you understand why shoreland standards are important. Then we'll go through some key fundamental concepts. We'll touch on the major performance standards. And then we'll go through some special topics, including PUDs, bluff determination, and environmental review. And then we'll close out with some administrative housekeeping stuff, and if we have time, we'll show you some of our online resources that I will be talking about during this training. So with that, let's go on here. So why are these standards important? The best way to answer this is to go back to the 1969 Shoreline Management Act. This act acknowledged the value of the state's public waters and shoreland areas, and that they are important enough to be protected through development regulations. The Act realized that Minnesota's lakes and rivers were statewide resources that are unique to Minnesota compared to most other states and were worth protecting for present and future generations. So the shoreline rules, and by extension your ordinance, protect these state designated resources. These shoreland areas are intrinsically different from other zoning areas that you regulate, because the shoreland areas provide water quality, habitat, and recreational and scenic resources to everyone in the state. And so with increasingly big changes in our climate, it's also more important than ever for you to be cautious and protect in how we develop around our shorelands. So first of all, one of the first reasons listed in the 69 Act was the preservation and enhancement of surface water quality. So as you know, nutrient flow into lakes and rivers from impervious surfaces, disturbed soils, and turf grasses lead to algae growth and accelerated eutrophication of lakes. And the shoreline rules work to limit impervious surface, vegetation cutting, and land alteration in ways to protect and enhance surface water quality. Another key purpose for the Act was the preservation of economic values. Property values can vary tremendously depending on the variety of things such as density, construction quality, neighborhood character, and other qualities unique to a property's location. The shoreland minimum lot size standards were designed to maintain property values consistent with typical urban and rural residential standards and to prevent very high density that would both degrade lake shores and ultimately property values. Also, keeping structures and septic systems away from bluffs and rivers is especially important in parts of the state with highly erodible soils and meandering rivers, as we can see here. A key part of preserving economic values as well as public safety is, especially with increasing amount of extreme rainfall events, is keeping structures away from the water. I just want to note though that the minimum structure and bluff setback standards that were developed in the 1989 rules didn't consider the extreme rain events and river movements that we're seeing today. So communities should proactively look at these standards for relevance in their community, and many communities have adopted more strict standards to protect properties from these risks. Shoreland standards for lot area, structure setback, impervious surface, and land alteration all work together to minimize the movement of sediment and phosphorus into lake, preserving both economic and water quality values. And there's growing evidence that water quality affects property values, at least in rural areas. A Bemidji State study showed that a 3-foot decrease in water clarity leads to a 22% decline in property value. So there's some real strong economic merit to protecting water quality. And finally, the last goal of the 1969 Act is the preservation of natural environmental values and the wise use of water. Now, this is a balancing act between unfettered development and development that sustains clean water, habitat, and scenic value. This is a balancing act that you'll sometimes hear state regulators refer to. And this is a difficult task, but one of the important concepts here is scenic character. And while this concept can vary from person to person and across the state, it's a difficult one to define, but most people know it when we lose it. And it's sometimes hard to know when you're losing it because it happens in very slow incremental values and steps. And it's oftentimes hard to detect. But once we lose it, it's impossible to get it back. So even though you may make many small land use decisions, or at least they seem small, the cumulative impact of these changes add up over time. With that, we'd just like you to remember these 5 words: natural shores equal healthy shores. And keep that in mind whenever you're working with your planning commission, your boards of adjustment, your elected officials, that retaining natural riparian vegetation or restoring it as conditions of approval is almost always a good decision. In this next section, I'm going to cover some key regulatory concepts and what type of water the shoreland rules pertain to. The first concept is the ordinary high water level. You've probably already heard of this, but it's really important to both land use regulations as well as the DNR's public water regulations. And so the ordinary high is simply a mark on the land. It's the highest water level that has been maintained for a sufficient time to leave evidence on the landscape. It's commonly the point where natural vegetation changes from mostly aquatic to mostly terrestrial. And you can see on the screen here, that blue line, that's probably where the ordinary high is on this property. It's sometimes hard to find out unless you have trained eyes, but you can also look at some of our online tools to get the ordinary high water level elevation for your lake. If you can't find it there, you can also talk to your area hydro. At the end of this presentation, I'll go through some of these resources that you can use. This slide here tries to show how this jurisdiction for different activities in the nearshore area can be located. And so we have the ordinary high water level running horizontally here. And above that line is the jurisdiction that you have for implementing local land use zoning standards and regulations, such as your shoreland ordinance. Below that line is where the DNR has jurisdiction for work in public waters under a variety of state rules. Another important concept is to understand the public's right to access water. Anyone who can gain legal access to the water, like through a public access, public right-of-way, a road that's next to the water, that person can boat, fish, hunt, swim, walk on the ice, or engage in any other domestic activity, recreational or otherwise, such as dropping an anchor or fishing and wading. It's completely in their right to do that. They cannot, however, go onto private property from the lake. They have to stay in the water. And of course, riparian property owners have many rights. These include the right to build a dock out to a navigable depth, to take water for domestic or ag uses, to use land added or exposed naturally, such as a period of long drought where some of the lake bed is exposed. That is something that the riparian property owner can access. And I emphasize naturally because you can't get more property by simply filling in the lake. So keep that in mind. That the property rights also extend to access to the water to boat, fish, hunt, swim, and any other normal use of the water. You cannot interfere with others' riparian property rights or those of the public, and the state government still has the power to subordinate the rights of riparian property rights to those of the public. So anyway, important concepts when you're working in the shoreland area. Shoreland is the state's largest land use program. It covers all lakes in counties of 25 or more acres. In cities, any lake that's 10 or more acres in size, and any water course draining 2 or more square miles. Lakes do include wetlands that are classified as 3, 4, and 5. These are typically shallow wetlands that usually have open water at least much of the year. The boundaries of shoreland are 1,000 feet from the ordinary high of a lake, or 300 feet from the river or the top of bank, or the landward extent of a floodplain designated by ordinance, whichever is greater. Now, I've highlighted that designated by ordinance because this is a direct reference or connection to your floodplain ordinance, and you need to understand what that means to administer your shoreland ordinance in areas along rivers where you have, floodplains. And so the language in a floodplain ordinance that the shoreland definition is referring to often looks like this phrase from the floodplain model ordinance. Here, the language is stating that if there's a conflict between the floodplain maps and the location of the base flood elevation, or BFE, based on field conditions, the BFE is the governing factor in locating the floodplain boundaries. This is an important issue for communities in the state that are still working with old floodplain maps that are not very accurate. And if you're in a community like this, you probably know it. But in these situations, the geographic reach of the floodplain ordinance actually follows the 100-year floodplain elevation rather than what's shown on the map. So, for example, this illustrates the issue. In this area, we only have a piece of land that's partially in the shoreland district. As you can see, the 300-foot buffer from the creek that's in the lower part of this photo. But this area isn't in the mapped floodplain. But most of it is in the floodplain because it's below the 100-year flood elevation and hydrologically connected to the stream. You can see this blue pipe that goes underneath the road that connects the stream to this low-lying piece of land. And so the boundaries of the shoreland district don't necessarily stop at the 300 feet from the creek. It includes all this area in light blue, and in this area, the shoreland standards would apply for any development. Okay, not seeing any questions on that, but feel free to ask. All right, so moving on, another important element in shoreline regulations is the idea of water body classifications. All public water lakes and streams are classified, and that classification then determines key development standards such as minimum lot size and width or setback standards. And a key concept here is that bigger and deeper lakes and rivers can better sustain human impacts of runoff, sedimentation, and nutrient loading. So they're classified in a way that accommodates more development intensity. This slide illustrates the relative development intensity for different types of lakes and rivers through the regulation of lot area and width standards. Just to read this, you can see we have standards along the left-hand side and the classifications for lakes and rivers along the top. And as you move to the right under lakes or rivers, the sensitivity of the water body to human development increases, and therefore we have more restrictive standards for development on those lakes. And the greater the number of plus signs indicates the intensity or more strictness of that standard. I'm not putting any details here, just conceptually to show you how this works. The last two slides in this section cover the two most sensitive shoreland areas. Shore impact zone is the first, or SIZ. The shore impact zone is always 50% of the structure setback, so it can vary depending on the lake or river classification. And you can think of it as a buffer zone that should be kept natural in order to provide room for vegetation, for natural stormwater management, as well as habitat, and to preserve lake character. This works to keep most development activity away from the shore to help reduce the risk of erosion. The bluff impact zone is the other area where intensive vegetation removal is prohibited and where a permit's required for land alteration of more than 10 cubic yards. And you can think of it as a bluff and then a 20-foot buffer along the top of a bluff. It's a little of an odd concept, but it's not only the bluff itself, but 20 feet from the top of the bluff. All right, so let's move on and talk about some of the key standards that are in all shoreland ordinances. And as we mentioned earlier, we've talked a bit about this already, but these standards vary with water body classification. And these tables from our model ordinance are just simply to illustrate the wide variety of permutations you can have based on classification, which is represented by different colors, also by whether there is sewer or septic system used on the site, and whether the lot is a riparian or non-riparian lot. So just to show you the range that can be expected, a single family home on a riparian lot connected to a city sewer system, that minimum lot size could range anywhere from 15,000 square feet on a general development lake to 40,000 square feet on a very sensitive natural environment lake. The lot size standards, or I should say like lot size standards, the ordinary high level structure setback varies based on classification and sewer type. Bluff setbacks from the top of the bluff are always 30 feet everywhere in shoreland. The shoreland rules also limit the amount of impervious surface to 25% on each lot. As you may or may not know, surface water runoff is the second biggest source of nutrient pollution after sewage effluent, and it carries road salt, goose poop, lawn fertilizers, and dirt. And there's a lot of phosphorus in dirt and sediment. But this standard isn't intended just to protect water quality. It also serves to limit the amount of hard surfaces in the nearshore area so that there's room for vegetation and the habitat that provides places to live for critters. Also provides that elusive lakeshore character, which many people appreciate. So while providing natural stormwater, this green space also provides a lot of other benefits. And so because of all these purposes for restricting impervious surface, the DNR doesn't favor changes to this standard or the use of permeable pavement. We understand permeable pavement is a valid stormwater management practice, but it's still a hard surface and it doesn't allow this green function to occur in nearshore areas. Okay, I see Christy asked about city sewer systems. She's wondering if a sewer could also mean a community sewer system or cluster septic system. And yes, we would include that sort of approach to interpretation in rural areas. All right, so one of our last topics in this area is vegetation management. The shoreline rules prohibit intensive clearing in the shore impact or bluff impact zone and on steep slopes. However, limited clearing is allowed for a wide variety of uses that are laid out in your ordinance and are listed here. We certainly understand that this is probably the most difficult standard in the shoreland ordinance to administer. I mean, many of you have thousands of miles of shoreland and shoreline to monitor. And so it's very difficult to monitor what's going on, all over the place on this account. But this is an area, though, where many communities are taking stronger action, and there's lots of opportunities here. Just to note, some communities are requiring restoration when violations are found, requiring restoration as a condition of some permits, and quantifying where and how much vegetation can be cut. That's in response to the fact that the shoreland rules are pretty vague about, what can be selectively cut. So we'll be talking about these kind of higher standards and more at our March 13th training on higher standards. So if you're interested in that, please come back on March 13th. So one of the last areas here again is about land alteration, and the shoreline ordinance has a permit requirement for disturbances exceeding the thresholds shown in the screen, but this is an area where communities can also do a little bit more. When you attach conditions to land alteration, The Shoreland rules certainly encourage you to assess impacts to wetlands, to use BMPs for managing sediment flow, keep it in place, and design specifications for riprap. When it comes to riprap, the rules do have specific standards. They're illustrated in the graphic here and are also in your ordinance. And this is one of the areas where local standards overlap DNR jurisdiction for work in public waters. The DNR public water rules allow the placement of riprap only when there's a demonstrated erosion problem, and riprap is not allowed for aesthetic reasons. Boulder walls are also not considered riprap. So your ordinance doesn't have those standards, but if a riprap project is below the ordinary high, then the more restrictive DNR standards apply. This is a hard thing to enforce unless there's some good coordination between the local government and the DNR. So if you're aware of any project like this here, and you think there's an opportunity for some potential impacts, it's always helpful to connect with your local area hydro. And the last standard we're covering here are minimum structure elevations. These are intended to reduce flood risk, and they always apply in shoreland. Where there are mapped floodplains with official flood elevations, those elevations are used. But in situations where they don't exist, we use the minimum elevations in the shoreland ordinance, which requires that the lowest floor be at least 3 feet above the ordinary high or the highest known water level, whichever is higher. All right, so any questions before we move on to special topics here? All right, well, let's move on. The first topic is the Shoreland PUD. This is often a confusing topic because it's frankly a really bad name. But there are two types. The first one, which we refer to as a commercial PUD, refers to transient lodging facilities such as resorts, campgrounds, and hotels. It doesn't apply to restaurants, office buildings, shopping malls, or any other type of commercial development. The residential PUD is just what it's like. Sounds like it's a development method for any type of permanent housing, whether single family, townhome, or apartments. In both cases, the PUD label is misleading. These are not PUDs in the traditional sense where a PUD is a negotiated development. The Shoreland PUD is a conditional use to allow higher intensity development in the shoreland as long as specified performance standards in the ordinance are met. So it's not a negotiated deal. It's a CUP that has very specific standards. And just as a side note, in order to work with the shoreland, residential PUD, there have to be at least 5 units in the development. So for any type of PUD, commercial or residential, there are 4 steps. In both types, the result of this design evaluation process is a determination of the number of units allowed. And on the screen here is an example of a residential development. So just briefly, the 4 steps. The first one is you need to draw what we call density analysis tiers. Hopefully you can see those on the screen. Tiers are used to spread density on a development site, and the formula within your ordinance has less density close to the water and more density in tiers away from the water. The tier depth can vary with water body classification. General development lakes have the smallest tier depth, and more sensitive natural environment lakes the greatest. The next part of this is to identify the acreage or area of land that is not suitable for development. Bluffs and wetlands and land below the ordinary high are not suitable, so they're subtracted from the total area to find that the remaining area is suitable. And that's the area in which you calculate density. The third step, one calculates the density or number of units allowed in each tier. It's a pretty simple calculation for residential units. For commercial PUDs, such as campgrounds and resorts, it's more complicated. I'll walk through a commercial example in just a moment. So hopefully that'll help. And then the last step is simply to apply the density bonus that's in the formula, it's in the rules, if your project qualifies. If it does, you can get some very high units unit counts, you can get up to 50% density bonus in the first tier, 100% in the second, and 200% in all other tiers. So despite what some developers might say, you can get quite a bit of density through a shoreland PUD. So I'm going to illustrate how this could work for a commercial PUD. In this case, we have a RV campground example. We have 60 proposed units or pads in 2 tiers, the blue tier and the green tier. Nothing's proposed in the tan or third tier. In this example, we've already subtracted out the wetland area in tier 1 so that the suitable area we're showing at 270,000 square feet has already taken out the wetland area. So this is the net suitable area on which we can calculate density. We also have the suitable area calculated for the other 2 tiers, just for your information. So calculating the number of units in a commercial PUD is a bit complicated, and I hope my process works for you, so please bear with me. One thing that you should understand is that the formula in your ordinance is designed to relate the unit size of, say, the hotel unit, room unit, the cabin size, or the campsite size. It relates the size of those units with the number of allowable units in total, so that the larger the average unit size, the fewer units you get. And this relationship is intended to recognize that occupants of larger units, a cabin at a resort or a very large campsite, those sorts of people tend to more intensely use lakes and shoreline areas than people who maybe just go to a hotel for a conference or a convention. And so that's why the formulas are designed the way they are. While not explicit, your ordinance contains this formula for calculating the number of units. And this is this is the formula you'll use for calculating density in each tier. The formula starts with the suitable area, which is then multiplied by the floor area ratio, which is in this table in your ordinance. And in this case here, you would multiply the suitable area times the floor area ratio, which is one of these factors, to get total floor area. You would then divide that by the average unit floor area, which also comes from this table. It's in this column here on the left-hand side. You will divide those two to get the number of units. And so in this case here, the ordinance actually specifies that campgrounds are determined to have an average unit floor area of 400 square feet. And since this is a general development lake, the second column here, it says sewer general development lakes or unsewered general development lakes, we can see that the ratio is 0.056. So I've done the math in this situation here. And so we just multiply the suitable area in the first tier of 270,000 square feet by the floor area ratio to get the total floor area of 15,120 square feet, divided by 400 square feet, which tells the developer they can have at least 37.8 units in the first tier. So that's how that all works. Thanks for working through this with me. And this is what like a spreadsheet would look like for all 3 tiers after you've done these calculations. And so the analysis for the first tier should look familiar. We just did that. We can see that, there's the 37.8 units that are allowed. That compares to up to 57 units you could get if you applied density, which in this case, there was no request for density. But the developer in this case is proposing 36 units, which is less than the number of allowed units, for a total of 60 units, which is 10 units less than the base units allowed under the base number of campsites column. So in a nutshell, it sort of explains how this is done. Before we leave this topic, just want to point out that all PUDs have to address a variety of performance standards, the most important which I've listed here on the screen. There is, of course, the 50% open space requirement. And to get to that 50%, you have to, at least if it's a residential development, 70% of the land within the shore impact zone has to be classified as open space, and 50% of the shore impact zone of a commercial PUD has to be considered open space. And, once you do that, you need to figure out how much more you need to meet the total 50% standard. And then if you can't, then you have to find that remaining 50% elsewhere on the project site. Other key standards include a requirement that all recreational facilities, such as beaches and mooring spaces, whatever you have, need to be centralized in one location to minimize impacts to the riparian edge. And one of the more difficult challenges is that the number of mooring spaces is limited to the number of units that you calculate and are allowed in the first tier. A little known fact that some people aren't aware of is that the DNR must approve shoreland PUDs for local governments without a DNR approved shoreland PUD standards. These PUD standards and the rules are optional, and that's because many communities simply don't want to allow this sort of density in their community. But, sometimes years or decades later, communities change their mind on that, and then they want to allow a PUD. And until you adopt these standards into your ordinance, the DNR has to review and approve them. So if any of you have ordinances like that and you think you're going to be looking at a PUD, I strongly encourage you to adopt the standards before you get an application.
We do have a question in the chat. I'll let you take care of it.
Okay, are there any incentives for developers to have less?
It looks like Matt provided a comment response as well.
So Matt is saying that to get the bonus density, the developer would require to shift further away from the water's edge. Some developers don't want to do this. To get the bonus density, the main factor that developers have to reach is increase the setback by 50%. But they also have to meet all the other standards, including these on the screen. But there are no incentives in the shoreline rules as an incentive to develop less. That's why some communities just haven't adopted the standards. But I have to say a number of communities have changed the standards so they get less. And that's probably the more direct route to go. If a community just doesn't want this kind of intensity, then they can change the standards and be more restrictive. And so if you're interested in that, I suggest you call me up or come to our March training on higher standards. Hope that helps, Joe. So we're moving on to bluffs, and there's a sequence of events in determining if you have bluffs. The first part of this is looking at your bluff definition, and your bluff definition has 4 parts to it. Once you determine you have a bluff using that definition, you need to locate the top of the bluff, and then lastly, you would determine if the bluff exemption criteria applies, and we'll walk through this for you. But the important thing to know is that this is a sequential set of criteria. If you're working through, the bluff definition, these 4 items here, if you're working through these and one of them is no longer true, then you don't have a bluff and you just stop. So it's a sequential process here. So let's look at the 4 parts to the bluff definition. The first step here states that part or all of the feature is located in shoreland. You've seen this graphic before. The bluff doesn't have to be completely in shoreland, and the reason is that you need to consider the entire feature wherever it's located to determine whether it meets the bluff stand criteria. If it does, then only that part of the bluff that's located in shoreland has to comply with the shoreland bluff standards. But we still need to consider the whole feature to work through the bluff definition. The second criterion is the slope must drain towards the water body. This doesn't mean that it has to drain directly to or even reach the water. You can see on the graphic here that water is flowing off of a series of slopes in different directions, but ultimately the flow of the water is towards the water body. So these features shown in this graphic would be considered a shoreland or potentially a shoreland bluff if they're located in shoreland. The next step requires that this slope feature rise at least 25 feet from the ordinary high. Here in this example, we have a slope that rises 28 feet above the ordinary high, so it passes this check. The ordinary high for many lakes can be found through DNR's Lake and Flood Elevation online webpage. It's a great source for finding out a lot of information about lakes and including flood elevations. So I'll show you that at the end of this training, so stick around for that. If you can't find the ordinary high or there's no data online for some of our resources, please contact your area hydrologist. And then finally, the last step in the bluff definition asks the question, does the slope from the toe to a point 25 feet or more above the ordinary high achieve a 30% or more slope? And in this case here, we can see that the slope rises 28 feet over a distance of 86.5 feet for a slope of 32.4%. So in this case, we have a bluff. Once you've determined that you have a bluff, then you need to find the top of bluff so that you know where to start the 30-foot structure setback from the top of bluff. Technically, determining the top of bluff can be tricky if you aren't out in the field with surveying equipment. However, you can do a desktop analysis like I've been showing here using data downloaded from Mintopo and our bluff profile tool. That's another resource. It's an Excel-based spreadsheet that you can use to estimate bluffs and find toe and top of bluffs. And so we have a bluff guidance document that'll guide you through that process, and I'll show you where that is at the end of this training. But in this graphic here, we can see that we have a top of bluff definition, which is the higher point of a 50-foot segment with an average slope exceeding 18%. I've tried to label that calculation here showing where the 50-foot segment is and where the top of bluff is, that is at the 18% plus slope percentage. And so we're showing the lower end of that 50-foot segment and the upper end, and the slope between those 2 points is just slightly over 18%. And so the upper end of that segment is where our top of bluff is, and that's where your structure setback starts. All right. The last part of this is to determine if the bluff exemption applies. This provision only applies to bluffs that are already determined to be bluffs under the criteria we've just walked through. This provision was put into the rules to allow relatively flat plateau areas between tiered bluffs to be buildable if structures can meet setback standards. This situation is very rare, but you may find this in areas of the state with very large bluff complexes. You might find a relatively flat area between very steep slopes on which you can build. And so on the right-hand side, we're showing contour lines downloaded from Mintopo that represents this sort of feature. And on the left is a graphic from the model ordinance that shows you, essentially what this feature might look like in profile. This is an important thing to be aware of. A number of property owners and some surveyors are confused about this and will use or confuse this exemption language with the toe and the top of bluff language. These definitions are very similar in how they're written, and so people will confuse these and maybe try to use this language to exclude certain parts of a slope from the bluff and say because it's excluded, it's no longer a bluff, and that makes it easier for them to develop. So there's a variety of reasons people might do that, but I want you to be aware of that and understand that these definitions are written slightly different, and if you apply them the way they're written, you would hopefully not make a mistake of excluding part of a slope feature from a bluff calculation. Let's see here. Environmental review. So last special topic. Many of you don't know that there is criteria for environmental review, mandatory review. There is triggers for residential campgrounds and resorts. If someone is proposing more than 15 units in a sensitive shoreland, that's a environmental assessment worksheet trigger. If they're proposing 25 units or more, then that's a trigger for a non-sensitive shoreland. People wonder, what is a sensitive shoreland? And the EQB has definitions for this. These are not DNR definitions, these are EQB definitions. But the most common one you'll find is a natural environment lake. So if you're seeing a development application come in for a resort or campground or a housing development on a natural environment lake, pay attention to the number of units and then look at the EQB rules to see if environmental review is needed. So with that, we're just going to go through some housekeeping things here with our administration. On our webpage, we have a model ordinance. We're continually updating that based on comments we get back. This model is consistent with the 1989 rules. It's just been rewritten from the original model ordinance. It uses more bullets and numbers. It's easier to find things. It's more concise and uses a lot of graphics. The version with commentary, play-by-play explanation of why we have certain provisions and what they mean. So if you're confused about even administering an existing ordinance, look up our model and the commentary version of that, and we may have some answers to your questions in there. We also have a review process. So whenever you adopt or amend an ordinance, we have this process on our webpage. We have pretty extensive process from step 1, notifying us, to step 5, adopting the ordinance. But if you are just seeking conditional approval, and it's a pretty standard approval process, you can start with step 3. That's explained on our website. But we do like you to follow this. This process helps us keep track and respond to you in a very timely fashion and avoid dropped balls. So we appreciate both you working through this as well as ourselves, and hopefully this makes everybody's job easier. I do want to note that we do have implementation flexibility for both the Shoreland and the critical area programs that we administer. These are DNR approved deviations from the rule provisions. And so if you have some special situations that you need to deviate, we're open to listening to that. Some of the common requests for that are to exceed the amount of impervious surface, or to expand nonconformities without a variance, or a bluff impact setback. In most cases, we're going to ask for you to provide some sort of offsetting higher standard to justify flexibility on some of these other standards. And typically we'll ask for some sort of riparian vegetation restoration. But it could be anything. We work with kind of the uniquenesses of your community's resources and development history. So that's all I really want to say there. But there is options for flexibility if you're running into troubles in administering your ordinance as it is. The key point here is just contact us very early in the process, because sometimes this might take a while to work through. And then just lastly, we know you're on the front lines administering these ordinances. We appreciate your efforts. We want to be a partner with you and help you do this work. So as such, we're here to provide you with training and education, technical assistance on administering your ordinance or interpreting how to apply that to a variance or a PUD. We will comment on a lot of applications, such as variances and PUDs, and then we also approve your ordinance. And for you, we're hoping that based on what you learned from us here today or in general, that you will explain the reasons for these regulations to your property owners, your elected officials. It will help you administer and enforce these standards and to make decisions, good decisions, we hope. And of course, you're also here to adopt and amend your ordinances and let us know within 10 days and 10 days after decision, both public hearings and afterwards. So that is what we do and what you do. And now I'd just like to kind of quickly stop sharing my screen here and just briefly share with you our webpage with a lot of our shoreline standards on it. So this is what our main shoreline page looks like. And under the regulations and administration section here, we have a lot of resources for you, local administrators. We have our model ordinances here, the ones with commentary and ones without. We have higher standards, We've referred to those throughout this presentation, so we have some examples that local governments have adopted here. This is the review and adoption process. It's a 5-step process. I alluded to it on one of my slides. We have lots of information on bluffs and steep slopes. And on this page at the bottom, we have a lot of resources, how to use MinTopo, a detailed guide for how to identify bluffs, way more detailed than I just shared with you. We have this Excel-based bluff profile tool, and a video presentation that goes into more detail about how to identify a bluff. Back on our main kind of regulatory page for local governments, we have a lot of resources at the bottom of this here, a lot of fact sheets on different kind of issues you might run into. And then also I want to point out that we have a classification page with some nice mapping features. And so you can go to this online ArcMap and pull up any kind of resource in the state, and you can see by color what the classification is. You can zoom around on that. You can find our wild and scenic rivers, their classifications here as well. And then also I just wanted to point out the lake and river.
Dan, if you're looking for the lake, and if you're looking for Elfio, I did put a link in the chat for
you did? Okay.
Attendees. So
okay, great.
Do have that.
Okay, I won't show that then, but thank you, Gary. That is what I was trying to find, and I didn't plan ahead for that. So, any case, that is where we are at, and we're getting close to the end of our time, but I'm available for any questions if people have them.
Dan, I'm not seeing any questions in the chat. I will share that in addition to DNR's Lake and Flood Elevation Online link, I also added a link to Lake Finder. That's another, that's on our DNR website. It's another good source for finding OHW and other lake level information. Sorry, Gary, there are some questions coming in. Go ahead.
Yeah, I just saw Aaron had a question. He asked how many times could a top of bluff setback be applied along the same slope? Could a 30-foot setback apply multiple times in a plateau situation where it becomes less than an 18% slope, and then once again at the traditional top when it tapers off to less than 18%? Yes, you could. And that's in these areas where I was talking about earlier, we often see around rivers, the Minnesota or the St. Croix. You will see in a few places on the Mississippi where you'll see very large bluff complexes where you'll see a bluff rise, taper off, it'll rise again. So yeah, in those situations, you could definitely see multiple bluffs and multiple tops of bluffs. And Christy was asking a follow-up to the bluff question. Do you apply top of bluff setbacks to plateaus? Yes, you would. If an example, if you had a bluff that was, say, rising up from a river and then it flattened out, and then at another distance it started rising again, at that plateau after the first rise, you would apply a top of bluff setback. And if there was room to meet the setback, you could build at that location. So I think maybe we're getting close to the end here, Gary.
I don't know if I mentioned this earlier, but I also included a link to the DNR area hydrologist. So many of you are going to work with your local area hydrologist on shoreland management and public waters permitting. So I did include the link to that.
Well, thank you, everybody. Like I said, if you want to follow up with me individually, my contact information is on our webpage. Or you can contact any of your individual area hydros.